They say you can measure a man by how much space he allows other people to take from him before he stops allowing it. I have found that to be true. I have also found that the moment a man stops allowing it rarely looks the way anyone expects. There is no shouting, no slam door, no speech written out the night before and rehearsed in the bathroom mirror at midnight. There is usually just a Tuesday morning, a room, a man who got there first, and a pot of coffee, because that is the kind of man I am. My name is Gerald Marsh. I am 55 years old. I have lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, for 34 of those years, arrived here for a job, stayed for a woman, built a life the way most men build lives, which is to say, quietly and without anyone particularly tracking the progress. I have been a commercial property manager for 28 years. I managed 12 properties through a holding company I registered in February of 1997 at the Knox County Courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Cost me $147 in filing fees, and which most people in my personal life have never thought to ask about. That is not unusual. People see what they expect to see. They see a man who drives a 2003 Buick LeSabre and wears flannel on weekends and does not speak first at family dinners, and they file him in the drawer marked accordingly. That drawer is comfortable. I have spent a long time in it. I have never once tried to get out. My father-in-law's name is Warren Aldrich. He is 73 years old. He retired in March of last year from 31 years as Regional Sales Director for Midsize Industrial Supply Company, a career he built with genuine effort and real skill, and which I have never once minimized myself or anyone else, because it deserves not to be minimized. Warren Aldrich started with nothing. His father left when he was 8 years old, and his mother worked 2 jobs in Maryville until Warren was old enough to work one himself. He put himself through 2 years of community college, talked his way into a sales position at 23, and did not stop moving forward for 5 decades. That is not nothing. I want to be clear about that before I tell you anything else. What I also want to tell you is that Warren Aldrich has one son. His name is Philip. Philip is 44, works in the same industrial supply corridor his father came from, a different company, a regional competitor. Actually, a detail Warren has never once acknowledged aloud, and Philip is, in Warren's internal cosmology, the proof. The proof that the hard years were worth it. The proof that the life worked. Philip is Warren's confirmation, and Warren guards that confirmation the way some men guard their savings. Carefully, reflexively, and with a deep suspicion of anyone who might cause the number to change. I married Warren's daughter, Carol, in September of 1996. We have been married for 28 years. We have 2 daughters, Nora, who is 26, and Diane, who is 23. Carol is a good woman. I mean that plainly, without the faint praise that phrase sometimes carries. She is steady and careful, and she loves her father the way a person loves a landmark, with full knowledge of its dimensions, its weight, and exactly which approach to take to keep from running into it. She learned that navigation young. I do not fault her for it. I learned, in the first years of our marriage, how Warren's house was organized. Philip at the center, Carol in a comfortable orbit around Philip, and the son-in-law, the quiet man from Knoxville who managed properties and drove the Buick and did not play golf, somewhere further out, in a ring that did not have a name on the seating chart, but was understood by everyone at the table. Welcome to Quiet House Stories. Get comfortable and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. I made my peace with the orbital situation sometime around 2006. There was a Christmas dinner that year where Warren spent 40 minutes detailing to the table the particulars of a deal Philip had closed in the third quarter, the dollar amount, the margin, the way Philip had handled the client, and looked up at the end of it and said to me, as an afterthought, "What are you working on these days, Gerald?" And I said something brief and accurate, and he nodded in the way that meant he had already moved on, and I picked up my fork and ate my pot roast. And somewhere in that moment, I decided that I was not going to spend the next 20 years of my life being injured by a man who simply could not see me. That is a decision that looks like peace. It is peace. It is also, if I am being fully honest, a decision that comes with a very long memory. The retirement dinner was on a Saturday evening, March 15th, at the Riverside Room at the Crescent Hotel in downtown Knoxville. Warren had arranged everything himself. The venue, the menu, the flowers, the seating chart. 62 guests across 4 round tables, and 1 long head table that seated 12. The room was dressed well. Warren had good taste in rooms. Always, Carol and I arrived at 6:47 in the evening. We had driven separately. She had come from her sister's house, where she had spent the afternoon, and we met at the entrance, and she looked lovely in the blue coat she saved for occasions. We found the seating board near the entry. Her name was listed with an arrow pointing toward the head table. Mine was listed with an arrow pointing toward a small auxiliary table, set for 8, positioned near the back corner of the room where the coat check closet was. The closet was not operating that evening. It still smelled like cedar and old wool. I want to be precise about what that placement communicates. You do not host 62 guests. Arrange a seating chart with care, and accidentally position your son-in-law of 28 years beside the cedar smell of a closed coat closet. Every name on a placement card like that is a sentence. Some sentences are written kindly. That one was not. I said nothing to Carol about it. I found my seat. I introduced myself to the 3 people at my table I did not know, 2 of Warren's former colleagues, and 1 man's wife who taught kindergarten in Oak Ridge, and I had a genuinely pleasant conversation with all of them about commercial real estate cycles and early childhood literacy and a restaurant on Market Square that had recently changed owners. I ordered a soda water with lime because the bar was moving slowly. I held in a white coffee mug someone had set out by mistake, and I looked at the room, and I was fine. Warren gave his remarks at 7:30. He stood at the center of the head table, at his natural home, and his voice carried easily because Warren's voice has always known how to fill a room without raising itself. He thanked colleagues. He thanked friends. He thanked his son, Philip, who sat to his right in the center chair, in a charcoal suit that fit him well, for his steadiness, his loyalty during the difficult transition years. He thanked Carol for her patience. He gestured warmly toward the room and said, "Family sits at the front. That's how I've always done it." I was 31 feet away, by my rough estimate. I was holding the white mug. I nodded. Then, when dinner arrived and the head table sealed itself into the conversation it had been having without me for the last 3 hours, I set the mug down on a cocktail napkin, said good evening to the kindergarten teacher, and drove home. I told Carol I had an early morning. She looked at me at the entry, not worried, not pitying, just reading me the way she has been reading me for nearly 3 decades. And she said, "Okay." I kissed her cheek and went to the parking lot and drove the Buick home through a March night that was cold and clear and indifferent in the way that Knoxville nights are when they have not yet decided to become spring. I made chamomile tea when I got in, steeped it 4 minutes, same as always. Then I sat at the kitchen table and opened the green file folder that had been sitting there since January. I need to tell you about the folder, not because it is dramatic. It is not particularly, but because it is a whole what this story is. It is a plain green file folder, the kind that comes 12 to a pack. Inside it were 3 documents: a lease renewal calendar page for the month of April, a property information summary for a commercial building at 1147 Whitmore Industrial Parkway on the eastern edge of the city, 12,400 square feet, light industrial use, clean and functional, and nothing remarkable, and a draft letter to my property attorney, Dennis Holt, whose office is on Providence Road, and who has been handling my leases since 2003. I had acquired 1147 Whitmore in 2011 as part of a 3-property portfolio deal. Total acquisition cost $1.3 million, which was fair for the market that year and has since appreciated in ways I did not fully anticipate at the time. The building had been under continuous lease since 2018. In November of last year, while reviewing my April renewal calendar on a Thursday evening at my desk, I pulled the tenant name for Whitmore and saw it for the first time clearly. Hargrove Regional Supply, Eastern Tennessee Division. I set the calendar down. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window for a while looking at the backyard. Hargrove Regional Supply was Philip's employer. I want to be clear about what I did with that information in November, because it matters. I did nothing with it. I set the folder on the corner of my desk and went on with the quarter. I had 7 other renewals to manage, 2 prospective acquisitions to evaluate, and a roof assessment on a property in West Knoxville that had been deferred 1 season too many. I was a property manager with a lease to tend to. I tended to it the way I tend to everything, carefully, without announcement, and without deciding anything before I had all the information I needed. Patience is the only currency that matters in a long game. Dennis called me on Monday, March 17th, 2 days after the retirement dinner. He had been in contact with Hargrove's Regional Facilities Director, a man named Tom Greaves, who wanted to schedule a face-to-face renewal meeting. The current lease was running at $9.40 per square foot annually. The market in that corridor had moved since 2018. Dennis had done the analysis and believed we could open the conversation at $11.25 per square foot and expect to settle somewhere in the range of $10.60 to $10.80, which over a 5-year term on 12,400 square feet represented a meaningful difference from the current rate. These things are discussed in person when the numbers are significant. That is standard. I told Dennis to schedule the meeting for Tuesday, March 24th at 9 a.m. at my office on Gay Street. I sat at the kitchen table after that call for a few minutes. The chamomile from Saturday night was long gone. The March light was coming through the window flat and pale. The green folder was on the table where I had left it. I am not a sentimental man, and I am not given to speeches, even internal ones. But I will tell you that I sat with the folder for a while and thought about 28 years with a particular clarity that sometimes comes when you have slept well and the house is quiet and you are not performing patience for anyone because no one is watching. I thought about the Christmas dinner in 2006 and the 40 minutes of Phillips' third quarter deal. I thought about 2018 when Phillips' company hit a difficult stretch and Warren called me specifically, to ask if I knew anyone who could use a man like Phillip, phrasing it as if I were a temp agency contact rather than a man who had, at that point, been quietly building a 10-property portfolio for 2 decades. I thought about 31 feet and a white mug and the smell of cedar from a coat closet that wasn't even open. And I thought, Phillip is going to walk through that door on Tuesday. I did not know that with certainty. But Phillip's title at Hargrove was Facilities Relationship Manager for the Eastern Tennessee Territory. The lease at 1147 Whitmore was his account. The renewal of a primary warehouse building was precisely the kind of meeting Phillip would attend. Not because he was required to, but because Phillip, like his father, understood that present at a table is a form of authority. He would be there. I was certain enough. I did not lose sleep over the week between the call and the meeting. I want to be precise about that, because there is a version of this story where the protagonist broods and rehearses and constructs something elaborate. That is not the story. I went to bed at 10:15 each night. I woke at 5:50 on Tuesday. I pressed the charcoal suit, the one I wear to closings, and made coffee in the kitchen and drove to Gay Street and was at my desk by 7:44 in the morning, which is where I am most mornings. Dennis arrived at 8:30. We reviewed the terms one final time, confirmed the tenant improvement allowance I had budgeted, $24,000, which was reasonable and would go towards some deferred HVAC work in the East Bay, and I set 2 white mugs on the conference table and a full carafe of coffee and a plate of pastries from the bakery 2 doors down on Gay Street, because that is what you do when you are the host. You make the room feel generous. You let the space work for you before anyone says a word. Tom Greaves arrived at 8:57. He had driven up from Chattanooga and was the kind of man who arrives 3 minutes early to demonstrate that he takes meetings seriously. He was straightforward, professional, and shook my hand with his whole hand. I liked him. I still do, actually. None of what followed was about Tom Greaves. Phillip arrived at 9:03 a.m. He came through the door in his charcoal wool coat, the same one from Saturday night. And he stopped when he saw me, not dramatically, not in a way that would register to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. He simply stopped moving for 2 seconds, maybe 3, in the doorway of a second-floor office on Gay Street in Knoxville, Tennessee, and his eyes moved from my face to Dennis's face to Tom Greaves's face, and then back to mine, and I watched him read the room, the conference table, the file folders, the letterhead visible on the top page of the stack in front of Dennis's place. Marsh Property Holdings, LLC, for 12 Gay Street, Suite 204. I stood up. I said, "Philip, good to see you. Grab a seat." He sat. He poured himself coffee. He set his hands on the table in a way that was carefully neutral. And I watched him, not obviously, not with any performance of watching, make the calculation that I had made 6 months earlier on a Thursday evening while looking at a renewal calendar. The building at 1147 Whitmore. The man across the table. 28 years. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a man when he stops being afraid and starts being dangerous. The meeting ran until 10:47 a.m. Dennis walked through the renewal terms methodically and well. Tom Greaves asked good questions. He knew the building, knew the market, and was negotiating in good faith. Philip was quiet for most of the first 40 minutes, which was unusual. Philip, in my experience, is a man who moves into a room rather than sitting in it. That Tuesday morning he sat in it. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at me occasionally in the way you look at something you are still resolving. At 9:31, I know the time because I noted in my meeting log, Tom Greaves said to me, "I'll be honest with you, Gerald. Our facilities team had this property flagged as a RIT holding for the last 2 years. We weren't sure we'd be talking to a local owner. I'm glad we're sitting down face to face." I said, "I'm glad we're sitting down to..." Philip said nothing. We settled at $10.80 per square foot. 5-year term, $24,000 tenant improvement allowance on the East Bay HVAC. It was a fair deal. I am not interested in taking more than something is worth. I am a property manager. I manage things. That is the whole of my ambition in a room like that one. And it is enough. When Tom Greaves stood to leave, he shook my hand at the door and said, "Your reputation in this corridor is solid, Gerald. People know your name." I thanked him. Dennis gathered his files. Philip pulled on his coat. He stood at the door for a moment. I was still at the table. He looked at me and said, "I didn't know you owned this building." I said, "You never asked." He nodded once, a single, deliberate nod, the kind that means a man has heard something and is still deciding what to do with it. And he went through the door. I sat at the table for a few minutes after they were all gone. The coffee carafe was still warm. The pastries were mostly gone. I looked at the empty chairs and the morning light coming to the window on Gay Street, and I did not feel triumphant. I want to be careful about that word, because it would be easy to use it and wrong to use it. A man does not sit in his own conference room after a routine lease renewal meeting and feel triumphant. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated than that. Something that had to do with 28 years in a green file folder and the smell of cedar from a closed coat closet, and the particular exhaustion of being a man who has spent a long time being arranged around rather than included. Warren called on Thursday, March 26, at 7:12 in the evening. I let the call go to voicemail. He left a message that ran 3 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I listened to it twice in the kitchen with the lights off, which is perhaps the most cinematic thing I did in this entire story, and I am slightly embarrassed by it. He did not apologize. Warren Aldrich does not apologize, not because he is cruel, but because apology requires the acknowledgement that another person's injury is real, and Warren has never fully developed that particular muscle. What he said instead was that he hoped the meeting had gone well, and that it was important for families to find ways to work together when opportunity presents itself, and that Philip had mentioned it seemed to go smoothly, and that he was glad. He was glad. I called him back on Friday at 8:14 in the morning. I let him complete a sentence, and then I said, "Warren, the deal is done. Fair terms for both sides. Philip's company has a good building for 5 years. That's the end of it." He said, "I just want to make sure there's no..." I said, "There isn't." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said he appreciated it. I said I knew he did. We ended the call. That was the whole of the confrontation. 2 sentences on a Friday morning. I have told you before, I am not a dramatic man. I don't make speeches. I don't slam doors. I do not need the last word. I just need the last move. Carol found out the same week from Philip, who told her in the parking lot after a Sunday dinner at her sister's house. She came home and found me in the garage underneath the Buick, changing the oil, which needed doing. And she did the thing she does when she wants to have a conversation without declaring it a conversation. She came and sat on the step stool by the tool chest. She was wearing her blue coat still. She did not say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "Philip says you own the building his company leases." I said, "That's right." She said, "Since when?" I said, "Since 2011. She was quiet. The garage in late March has a particular cold to it, the kind that comes up through the concrete. And she pulled the coat around herself and looked at the underside of the Buick for a moment. Then she said, "Did you plan it?" The timing. I thought about how to answer that honestly, because Carol deserves honesty more than she deserves a clean story. I said, "I didn't engineer the meeting to cause harm. The lease came up in April. The meeting needed to happen. Philip was going to be in that room regardless of anything that happened at the Crescent Hotel." She said, "But you knew." I said, "I knew in November. The dinner was in March." She nodded. Then she said more quietly, "But you didn't tell him." I thought about that question for a moment. Not the answer, which I already had, but whether the answer was one I was willing to say plainly. Then I said, "He didn't ask." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she got up from the step stool, put her hand on my shoulder, briefly, firmly, the way she does, and went inside. We have been married for 28 years. We do not require volume to say what matters. I want to say something about Warren, because fairness requires it, and because something my daughter Nora said in May has stayed with me in a way that things stay when they are more true than comfortable. We were sitting on the porch on Sycamore Lane in the early evening, Nora with a cup of coffee, me with mine, the rose bushes along the fence showing the first color of the season, and she said, out of no particular preceding conversation, "You know Grandpa Warren had nothing, right? Like genuinely nothing. His dad left when he was 8. He built every single thing himself." I told her I knew that. She said, "I've been thinking about it. I think Philip is his proof. Like, Philip existing and doing well is how Grandpa Warren knows the hard part worked. And I think that means if someone else builds something just as solid, someone who didn't see building it, it kind of breaks the math for him." I sat with that for a while. The evening was warm enough finally, the kind of warm that feels like permission after a long winter. Nora went inside eventually, and I stayed on the porch with my coffee and looked at the rose bushes. She was right. Warren's diminishment of me has never been personal malice. It has been something more architectural than that. A man who built Philip as the load-bearing wall of his own legacy, and who therefore could not afford to see that anyone else had been quietly building alongside him all this time, in a different part of the neighborhood, without asking for approval or attention or a seat at the head table. To see that would require Warren to revise a story he has been telling himself for 50 years. And some stories are too structural to revise without bringing down the whole house. I do not excuse it. A wound is not a permission slip. But I understand it now in a way I did not in March, and understand it has taken some of the weight out of it. Quiet men are not empty men. Simple is not small. It is September now. 6 months since the dinner. The Whitmore building is occupied. The HVAC work in the East Bay is underway, and Tom Greaves sent me a handwritten note in August saying the new rate was fair and his team was glad to extend. That note is in a folder on my desk. A different folder, blue, not green. Warren and I have seen each other 4 times since March. Twice at family dinners. Once at Nora's graduate orientation in Chattanooga. Once at Diane's birthday gathering at Carol's sister's house. He is not different, exactly. But something in the way he looks at me has changed. A small recalibration. The kind you would not notice if you hadn't been watching for 28 years. He asks me questions now. Sometimes. Small ones. The kind a man asks when he has quietly decided that another man might have an answer worth hearing. I don't make too much of it. He is 73. The architecture does not change that fast. Philip and I had coffee in August. His suggestion, which surprised me more than the meeting had. We met at a diner on Central Avenue on a Thursday morning at 7:45. Eggs for him, coffee for me. And we talked about the East Bay work, about his company's plans for the territory, about a property on the south side of the corridor he had heard was coming available. He was easier than I expected, less performing. He laughed once at something I said about a contractor, a genuine laugh. The kind Philip does not produce when he is in a version of himself he reserves for his father's table. Near the end of breakfast, he said, "I told Dad that you've been fair." I said, "That's all I was trying to be." He picked up the check when it came. I let him. Some gestures mean what they are meant to mean, and it will be unkind to refuse them. I drove home through Knoxville in the early morning. The city just starting to open around me, the river visible for a moment from the bridge, and I thought about the dinner in March, the white mug, the cedar closet, Warren's voice carrying easily across 31 feet of rented event space. Family sits at the front. That's how I've always done it. He was right about that. He was always right about that. What he did not account for was how large the family actually was, and how long some of its members had been at work, while he was looking somewhere else. I do not feel triumphant. That is the honest and complete truth of it, and I think it is important to say so plainly, because this kind of story can harden into something that feels like victory, and victory is not what I have. What I have is a signed lease and a cup of coffee on a September morning on Sycamore Lane, and a 28-year marriage to a careful woman who put her hand on my shoulder in a cold garage and said nothing else, because nothing else was needed. The cost of quiet is that you spend a long time being unseen. I knew that when I chose it. I chose it because the alternative, pushing, insisting, performing my worth for a man who had already decided what I was worth, felt like a waste of the one thing I cannot get back, which is time. I have 12 properties and 2 daughters, and a wife who reads me correctly from across a crowded room, and I have a Tuesday morning in March that nobody saw coming except me. Whether that was the right way to live all of it, I still don't know. I am 55 and still learning the difference between patience and disappearance, between composure and concession, between a man who chooses quiet because it serves him and a man who chooses it because he is afraid. I think I have mostly been the first kind. I hope I have been mostly the first kind. The building on Whitmore is still mine. The deal is signed and filed. The man next to the coatroom drove home. And in September, on the porch, with the roses coming in, that is enough. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Quiet House Stories. I will see you on the next one.